BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. And hello, everybody. Today is Monday, another Zodiac Monday. Welcome to the show. In this episode, I will be talking to you guys about a brand new Zodiac killer suspect whom I've never discussed on the channel before, and that will take up the majority of the second part of the show, and you can follow along with the timestamps that are pinned in with the quick reference. But I would also like to go through several different pieces of Zodiac killer news. Firstly, thank you so much to everyone who decided to listen to the three-part presentation with Paul Brookbanks, which has now been made into a playlist called The Zodiac Killer's Architecture. And Paul also made a graphic image that I would like to share with you guys right now. And it's talking about different Zodiac killer, either suspects or people who are connected to the mystery. The Zodiac killer was a serial killer who operated in California in 1968 and 69, and whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. And the three people that are featured in Paul's graph are Arthur Lee Allen, the prime suspect, Don Chaney, who was a friend of Arthur Lee Allen, and Ron Allen, who was Arthur Lee Allen's brother. And what Paul has wanted to do is to just show that there are different physical similarities among these three people to the Zodiac Killer's composite sketch, and there are also differences. And firstly, I don't think Arthur Lee Allen requires much of an introduction. He's Robert Graysmith's suspect. He's the one that's featured in the 2007 Fincher film. And I'm so glad that Paul decided to make a chart like this, because I have been saying this for ages, and I've been thinking about this for ages. People zone in on Arthur Lee Allen so much, yet I think that he is, in so many ways, too different than the witness descriptions. Firstly, Arthur Lee Allen has a very round face, and if you look at the Zodiac Killer's composite sketch, that person actually has somewhat of a narrow jawline and a pointed chin, whereas Arthur Lee Allen had a very noticeable rectangular jawline. But there's even something bigger than that. How about hair? I mean, the person that was seen after the murder of Paul Stine on October 11th of 1969, who is featured in the Zodiac Killer's composite sketch, has a very clear full head of hair and a crew cut and a widow's peak, and Arthur Lee Allen was a balding man, absolutely different. Secondarily, even the Lake Berryessa voyeur, who is also featured in Paul's graph, who is a possible sighting of the Zodiac Killer. We aren't 100% sure if that was the Zodiac or not, but that person also had a very clear full head of hair, much darker than the person who was witnessed after the Stein murder. But all of these observations about the people connected to the Zodiac Killer mystery are in complete contradiction to Arthur Lee Allen as in terms of physical descriptions. Now, the similarities between Arthur Lee Allen and the witness descriptions are that Cecilia Shepard witnessed the Zodiac Killer at Lake Berryessa on September 27th of 1969, and that's when the Zodiac Killer is wearing the hood and carrying the knife, and she estimated that that person was 6 feet tall, and Arthur Lee Allen was 6 feet tall. Also, Arthur Lee Allen was somewhat of a bigger guy, and almost all people, whether it's Cecilia Shepard, Brian Hartnell, Mike Michaud, they all describe the Zodiac as bigger, maybe barrel-chested, beefy, but not overly fat, and I think that matches up for Arthur Lee Allen. But the real focus of this graph that was created by Paul Brookbanks is to show that there are other people who might match these similarities to the witness descriptions, who have connections to Arthur Lee Allen outside of Allen himself. Don Chaney is a Zodiac Killer suspect who's the subject of the book Sighting In on the Zodiac Killer by Drew Beeson, as well as frequently discussed on Drew's show, The Zodcast. And Don Chaney does have a lot of similarities to the Zodiac Killer's physical description, but what Paul points out is Don Chaney did have what's perhaps called a receding hairline that looks somewhat like a widow's peak, except his was overly much larger, definitely more extreme than what is featured in the Zodiac Killer's composite sketch. And it's possible that Don's hair was receding a little bit more, and Don Chaney could also grow out his hair very long, we should point that out, and he could have combed it or styled it in a way that would have made the widow's peak appear less intense. But there's also an individual featured on this chart named Ron Allen, who is Arthur Lee Allen's brother, and Paul Brookbanks wants to be very clear about something. He is not accusing Ron Allen of being the Zodiac Killer. He is not making any direct accusation of any kind. He is simply just looking at some differences between Arthur Lee Allen and his brother Ron Allen, and Paul is a landscape architect, and he noticed that some of the Zodiac Killer's illustrations, like the bus bomb diagrams, appeared almost as if they were drawn by a landscape architect, and Ron Allen was a landscape architect, and that's what allowed him to make some observations about the case, which you can hear in the three-part presentation, The Zodiac Killer's Architecture. But what he shows is that Ron Allen is actually the person who has somewhat of a wide face with the cheekbones and then the pointed jawline. Ron Allen is the one who actually has somewhat of a similar hairline as opposed to Arthur Lee Allen, who was balding. And I thank Paul for creating this graphic here. And I'm just going to turn it over to you guys and put your feedback in the comment section down below. What do you think about any of the comments that I have made so far? And there are a lot of people who are making observations about the case, and some of them are rather fascinating. And one of them is named Sphere the Cube, and he is someone whom I consulted with for a Zodiac Killer series called the Moraga Letters that is available here on this channel. Not only that, it evolved into something more or less called the Zodiac Killer Moraga Connection. Moraga is a town in California, and Sphere the Cube, or Sphery as he is known, has a suspect named Robert Volvins. And Robert Volvins is a pseudonym, but that's what we have chosen to call him because we want to just respect Sphery's choices in his research, and there are some reasons why he chose to do that. But with Sphery's observations, it goes so far beyond just who was the Zodiac Killer, who committed these homicides in 1968 and 69. It goes to the point of looking at how and why the Zodiac Killer was thinking. Now, the Zodiac used some very either intricate or esoteric language, depending on the way you want to look at it. And he said that he used the word radians in a couple different places. And what Sphery actually did was looking at a place that the Zodiac Killer talked about, Mount Diablo. And then the Zodiac said concerns radians and inches along the radians. And the reason why I want to share this graphic with you is because Sphery is simply showing how global the Zodiac Killer can go. Because when you have radians, an angle of 57.29 degrees, or just different angles they can be put in different places, they don't necessarily stop in any geographic direction or geometric direction. They can actually take over the circumference of the Earth. They can just keep going in all types of circumnavigating directions. And I just think that that is something that is very fascinating because Sphery really points out that the Zodiac Killer is not some guy who is just dumb. He is someone who perhaps has a very high understanding of certain subjects like mathematics, linguistics, maybe even things like theology. And you can see more about his Zodiac Killer material on Facebook. He uses the name Sphere the Cube. He has a Facebook page. And also, he frequently posts in a group called the Zodiac Killer Library. And you can also check out some of the observations that Sphere has made in the series, the Zodiac Killer, the Moraga Letters, the Zodiac Killer Moraga Connection. And I think that a big difference between Sphery's Zodiac theory and a lot of other researchers out there is Sphery has explored the possibility of the Zodiac Killer murdering a girl named Laura Jean Dugan from 1972. And I also have an episode about that discussing his theory or hypothesis, and it's called Did the Zodiac Killer Murder Laura Jean Dugan? And I invite you to check that out. And you can always hit the like button and subscribe if you want to follow along with all of these true crime discussions. I do a segment about the Zodiac Killer every Monday here, Zodiac Monday. And on Fridays, I do something called the Anything Goes Friday segment, where any subject is fair game. And last week, I was discussing a book called Anthrax to Zodiac by Denise Diana Huddle. Just in case you did not hear that episode, I want to share something with you right now. And that's an observation that is not only from the presentation and not only from the book, but this is just something about the Anthrax Killer and the Zodiac Killer. Now, the Zodiac Killer has been completely unidentified, although some people insist they know his identity, and they have shared their findings to the public. He has not been identified to everyone's satisfaction. The Anthrax Killer quite possibly could have been identified as an individual named Bruce Ivins, who was going to be arrested and charged for everything, but he committed suicide before that was possible. But the thing that I want to share with you, in case you didn't hear the Anything Goes Friday segment, was the Zodiac Killer and the Anthrax Killer both didn't really seem to care too much about committing murders. And with the Anthrax Killer, it's a little bit more obvious because the Anthrax Killer was mailing in letters to people like Tom Daschle or Tom Brokaw, and the letters aren't actually reaching the specific targets, and the people that died because of the anthrax killer were not the intended targets at all, and there weren't any follow-up attempts to go after the intended targets. Say, for example, writing a letter to Tom Daschle or Tom Brokaw, and subsequent attempts were not made to murder these individuals, meaning that the specific targets really had no relevance in the anthrax killer's master plan, and it almost seemed as if just this person is trying to commit these crimes for the sake of committing these crimes, for spreading the image of terror, to fuel his own excitement, and probably some other similar motives. With the Zodiac killer, I believe that it's absolutely the same thing. Now, the Zodiac killer was much more hands-on and much more confrontational than the anthrax killer. He's not committing the crimes from a distance. He's not committing the crimes by using something toxic in the letters. Zodiac killer is shooting and stabbing the victims in the known crimes. But as far as caring about committing murder, no, I really don't think the Zodiac killer did, because the Zodiac did not put forth a strong effort to make sure that the victims were dead. Now, at Lake Herman Road, David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were the first two victims that were shot, and they were both murdered. But at the Blue Rock Springs shooting, I think the Zodiac killer put somewhat of a reasonable effort in trying to murder both Darlene Ferrin and Mike Mageau, the two victims, but he definitely didn't make sure that they were dead, because Mike Mageau would go on to survive the Blue Rock Springs shooting. But absolutely the biggest example of this, and the biggest supporting point to this claim that I just made, is that with the Lake Berryessa stabbing, the attack on Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, the Zodiac could have easily killed both of these people. He had a firearm that he could have shot them execution style with. They were tied up and he stabbed them, but he could have slit their throats and made sure that both of the victims were dead. And he didn't do any of those things. And both of the victims would go on to live for a period of time. Cecilia Shepard would pass away 2 days later in the hospital, and Brian Hartnell is still alive to this day. The reason why people like the anthrax killer and the Zodiac killer would operate would be more in line with something to the effect of, they want to create the image of terror. They just want to have power over people. Like, why create the image of terror? Why fuel their own excitement? Why do they get any type of rush or emotional satisfaction from this? Because they want to have power over people for some type of twisted, self-serving reason. And it often gets into the concept of, you don't want to unravel the thinking of a madman, because it might just be genuine psychotic nonsense, psychobabble, and I think that we will be able to understand it more if we are ever able to identify the Zodiac killer. But I honestly don't think that the Zodiac cared too much about committing the murders. He wanted to commit crimes so he had an audience for writing the letters. And people would pay attention to his ciphers, his cryptograms, and they would want to solve them. Now, why would they want to do that? Because he's a murderer. If he were just somebody mailing in ciphers without any threat, maybe one or two people would take a look at it, but not to this level, not to these proportions. So that's what I think the Zodiac killer was about. He wanted to do something just to get people to notice the Zodiac killer persona. Absolutely not his identity. And I mean, I think the Zodiac did not want to get caught. I think that if he wanted to get caught, it would have been so easy. I think that he genuinely wanted to stay a free man, but what he wanted to do was get people to look at the Zodiac killer character. He doesn't want the attention specifically. He wants the Zodiac persona to have the attention, and that's a little bit of hair splitting, but I think you can get the general idea that that's the focus of his activities. And right now, I would like to get to your supporter shoutouts from BuyMeACoffee.com. BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNid88 allows you to make a donation or a contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And you can also use the super thanks on YouTube if you would like to donate that way, and you will still get your shout out. And the first one comes to us from Batman66. Thank you so much for your regular and consistent support. Much appreciated. And next we have River Prawn Pottery. And you guys are really doing an amazing job. And we even have Mark Winter, who has become somewhat of a regular supporter. Mark, I can't thank you enough. This really means a lot, and it really helps out the channel. And lastly, we have one from DNA King. And I thank all of you guys. These ones do not have messages attached to them. But again, this stuff is really allowing Black Box Online Radio to grow and expand. And if anybody else would like to make a donation or contribution to help support the show using buymeacoffee.com/blackboxnid88 or the super thanks on YouTube, you will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday next week. And there are lots of other things on buymeacoffee.com. If you go over there for the month of March, you will have the opportunity to purchase a hard copy of one of the publications called True Crime Teaches Us to Conquer Toxic People, or the Black Box Online Radio True Crime Shorts Anthology. They are original publications being sold on BuyMeACoffee.com, so that Amazon.com doesn't have any enormous monopoly on publishing. And I mean, you can also get an electronic copy at any time, anywhere in the world, but only for the month of March 2024 will you be able to purchase a hard copy, which I will mail to you directly from West Virginia, wherever you are in the United States, U.S. shipping only. But feel free to go over there, buymeacoffee.com/blackboxnid88, and have a look at the store and see what's available. But more importantly, I told you guys that I was going to be talking to you about a new Zodiac killer suspect. And I want to be clear about something. Everything that you're going to be seeing, for the most part, is the work and creation of someone using the name Queen City Stripes. Queen City Stripes. And I might refer to this person as QCS. But this is a suspect that was shared with me by QCS, and this is my opportunity to share the suspect with you. QCS has created a PowerPoint presentation, and there are some slides here that I want to talk to you guys about. Firstly, it seems that QCS has a very high understanding of computers and is working with things like Python, which is well over my head and beyond my knowledge pool, but I think that I can understand the research process. And that is that we all know that the 340 cipher that was created by the Zodiac Killer was cracked by David Ornchak, Earl Van Eyck, and Sam Blake. And the computer definitely helped and aided and abetted. Now, one thing I do agree with Chad Burke on is that Chad Burke is someone who attempts to solve the ciphers using more or less the pen and paper, and any code that was created by man can be cracked by man. But sometimes the computer can assist. And what QCS wanted to do was look at the Zodiac Killer's third cipher, the Z13, and think, now, maybe some way, somehow, this person's identity is actually found in the Z13 cipher. So firstly, QCS began using a program to try and solve the cipher from right to left, the way that we would read the English language. Then QCS had the idea of thinking, well, now wait a second, why don't we try to solve the Z13 going from right to left? Did I say right to left first? I was saying left to right. Left to right is the first attempt, right to left is the second attempt. And Harvey Hines, the person who brought Lawrence Kane forward as a Zodiac Killer suspect, also believed that the cipher could be solved from right to left, like the way you would read a language such as Hebrew or Arabic or maybe some other ones out there, from right to left. But I'm actually just going to read something that was written out by Queen City Stripes, QCS. Over the past few months, I've been working on the Z13 cipher and applying various methods and commonly known cipher techniques to produce matching names. All solutions have been compiled into one spreadsheet, and I'll show that for you guys in a second. Using Python programming along with male first names from Social Security data, and there are 8,309, and surnames from the census, there are 151,671, we can search the names that match the cipher, and these names can be researched through public records and Ancestry. Okay, so now, again, using a program, going through the database, and one of the names that matched up with the cipher using this program was Donald L. Blinko. And what I believe Queen City Stripes did was think, okay, now, we have this list of names. Let's see if any of the names on the list were actually Bay Area residents at the time of the Zodiac murders and actually living in Northern California or nearby and actually are age appropriate and are actually Caucasian males the way that the Zodiac Killer was. And Donald L. Blinko came up. And this is also one that has a condition. One thing that QCS really wanted to share with me was that QCS is not accusing Donald L. Blinko of being the Zodiac Killer, and QCS is also not saying that they have solved the Z13 cipher. It is simply an attempt to share the message that this is what the program came up with. These are the names that were explored, and these are the results that were generated, and this is what came out of the program, and it's the result, more or less. Donald L. Blinko Donald Loyal Blinko. He was born on February 26th of 1927, and he passed away on December 6th of 2013. He was 42 years old in 1969. He was 5 feet 9 inches tall, although his draft card said that he was 5 feet 10 inches tall. He had brown hair. He was born in Portland, Oregon, grew up in Portland, Oregon, and even attended high school in Portland, Oregon. Donald L. Blinko was in the military. He was in the Coast Guard, and he enlisted in the Coast Guard in 1945 during his senior year of high school. During World War II, the Coast Guard manned hundreds of naval ships as part of the war effort, and he trained at the Coast Guard Island in Alameda. He served aboard the USS General Hodges from April 9th of 1945 to May 8th of 1946, and he worked as a radar operator during the war. This is something that Dale Julin, author of Catching Zodiac, likes to talk about when he says that the Zodiac symbol, the circle with the cross going through it, is thought by many to be the scope of a gun, but in reality, it actually could be the center of a radar machine that is used by the military. And of course, Dale Julin, author of Catching Zodiac, has a suspect named Gary Francis Post, who was also a radar operator. And I just wanted to point out that this is something that is somewhat widely discussed, and I will show you guys some samples of Donald L. Blinko's handwriting, but there's something else that really stood out to me in the presentation that was created by Queen City Stripes, and that relates to some of the interests that have been documented and some of the education that Donald L. Blinko had. Firstly, he was educated in cryptography, and the Zodiac Killer, of course, created codes. As I said, the Z13 became somewhat fundamental to QCS's research and exploration of the mystery. Cryptography, meteorology, explosive devices, charts and terminology used in conjunction with a compass, and light opera. And light opera was on the list as I'm just reading through this presentation that was created by Queen City Stripes, and I was thinking, okay, I follow what you're saying, but is all of this stuff really true? I mean, before you had shared this stuff with me, I had never heard of Donald L. Blinko. Was he really into all this stuff? Yeah, okay, cryptography, I get it. He's a radar technician working in the Air Force, and as I said from reading about Gary Francis Post, it becomes rather apparent that radar technicians work with either cryptography or exposure to the types of symbols that would have been used. But I mean, was this how much of a light opera fan was this Donald L. Blinko? And I will get to that in just a second. I want to keep going with the presentation. Donald L. Blinko graduated from Oregon State University in 1951 with a bachelor's degree. He resided in Long Beach, California from sometime in the 1950s until 1963. He married Priscilla Mary Ann Nassan in 1958, and Donald and Priscilla moved to 5 Sausalito Boulevard in Sausalito, California in 1963, and he worked for several companies as a financial analyst and business executive while living in the Long Beach and the Bay Area. And there are a couple photos that have been shared by QCS of Donald L. Blinko. One of them is from 1950, one of them is from 1981, and there's even one from 1945. And these aren't exactly from the time of the Zodiac murders. There are some, of course, several years apart, but he is a Caucasian male who's 5 feet 9 inches tall, and I think that all of that does match up with the Zodiac Killer's height and weight and description. Now, as I said previously, it was estimated by Cecilia Shepard that the Zodiac Killer was 6 feet tall, but it was also estimated by Mike Mageau that the Zodiac Killer was 5 feet 8 inches tall, and estimated by Donald Falk to be 5 feet 10 inches tall. Now, if you think about some guy who's 5'9", 5'10" while he's wearing shoes, I think that just reconciles all of it. So his height is somewhat appropriate. Now, worked for several companies as a financial analyst and business executive in the Long Beach and Bay Area. This, I think, is almost something that's becoming more and more widely discussed, and I think one of the reasons why is because Mike Rodelli, author of In the Shadow of Mount Diablo, has a suspect who was a very high-profile businessman named Shel Cavalli, and recently I've talked to you guys a lot on the channel about another Zodiac Killer suspect named John Parr Cox, who was discussed on the channel Real Zodiac Killer Revealed, run by Adam Ivester, and he was also a high-profile businessman and executive, and it's not completely out of the ordinary now for a financial analyst and business executive to become the forefront and central focus of a Zodiac killer theory, but you also heard that Donald L. Blinko was married in 1958. 11 years before the Zodiac murders. He would have been 42 at the time of the Zodiac crimes. So this had to have been a very, very prominent individual, a very somewhat successful individual in terms of his accomplishments. I mean, I don't know everything about this guy, but it seems like he definitely had certain career accomplishments, educational accomplishments, and he's just living a complete double life. It is possible for serial killers to do that, and most of the serial killers that we find are somewhat middle class. I think a lot of them are even low class, and every day on Black Box Online Radio, I try to release a short, which also comes out as a reel on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. Really, we call them reels on Instagram and Facebook. And a lot of the stories that I've been talking about are very working class individuals who go on to become serial killers, or there are some people who just fall off the rails a bit, and their deviant behavior and their criminal activities escalate from things like assaults and stealing to murder, and they can definitely happen in all walks of life. So why would high-profile executives be any different? But some more information about Donald L. Blinko. Donald and his wife Priscilla moved to Sausalito to 196 Stewart Drive in Tiburon, California, near Paradise Cay around 1969, and resided there until his death in 2013. Donald and Priscilla were involved in the San Francisco Opera's Marin chapter and frequently attended performances in Marin County in San Francisco in the 1960s and 70s. This included the Geary Theater, which is located at the intersection of Mason and Geary in San Francisco, and that's where the Zodiac killer allegedly got into a car and went to murder Paul Stein, the taxi driver, on October 11th of 1969. Donald was a member of the Marin County Republican Council in the 1960s and 70s. Donald and Priscilla did not have any children. Donald died of lung cancer on December 6 of 2013 at the age of 86. Priscilla died on May 3rd of 2020 at the age of 88. And I've gone through this presentation before, though, so I can definitely see and understand that Donald L. Blinko was not just a one-off politician who just ran for some type of vacancy. He definitely was what we would call a local politician, and sometimes serial killers are involved with local or small-time politics. Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, just to name it, two that are off the top of my head. So that doesn't mean that it's going to eliminate someone, because already, I know some people are going to have doubts. Financial analyst, local politician, was this guy really the Zodiac? I mean, I just think that this light opera connection is something that should not be downplayed. I told you I would come back to it, because when I was going through this presentation for the first time, I told you I was looking at what QCS had written out. All right, this guy had cryptography training, and he understands things like angles and radar systems. Oh, and he's also really into light opera, and the Zodiac was all about the operetta The Mikado from Gilbert and Sullivan, quoting or badly quoting the Mikado all the time. And it's even possible that the Zodiac killer wore the hood at Lake Berryessa because he wanted to show off and act like the executioner, the Lord High Executioner from the Mikado. And it turns out this guy is actually very, very much into opera, and we'll even see some more things about that. Right now, I bet you guys are curious about one thing, and that is, does QCS have a good sample of his handwriting? And the answer is yes. Here is a Social Security application from Donald Loyal Blinko, also known as Donald L. Blinko, and I think that his handwriting is somewhat similar to the Zodiac killer's. He definitely has the unusual tilt to the right with a lot of the letters. He also seems to have some similar letter shapes. I think that Donald L. Blinko is actually very inconsistent with a lot of the letters that he is writing. I think that the uppercase D's that he has created, even in his own name, Don, I mean, you can see he wrote the name Don with quite a different shape to the uppercase A than he had on Donald. So you can interpret that any way you want, that he is being inconsistent with his letter shapes. When we look at some of the other letters, I think that his uppercase F is very similar to the Zodiac, and I'm not a handwriting expert or anything like that. I'm purely using some superficial analysis, but I think that it really is just quite remarkable the way that QCS went through all of this, putting possible names into the system or generating possible names. Let's say that. And one of the names that matched up was Donald L. Blinko. There was a Donald L. Blinko who is age appropriate and is actually matching up to all of this criteria about someone who had an understanding of codes, who had an understanding of opera, who would have been matching a lot of the witness descriptions, because as I said, he was 42, and Officer Falk even described the Zodiac as possibly being in his early 40s. Now, that is just one of the discrepancies that we experience all the time in the Zodiac killer mystery. Brian Hartnell estimated that the voice he heard at Lake Berryessa was between 20 and 30. Mike Mageau thought maybe mid-20s to early 30s, and Officer Falcus thinking as old as the 40s, but he had a rather clear look at the person who allegedly murdered Paul Stein, and I mean, would somebody who's age 42 be able to pass for a 20-year-old's voice or a 30-year-old's voice? I would think so. I mean, actually, I do know that. I know so because I listen to, talk radio from time to time, and you can hear those call-in shows. You guys must have heard this, right? When somebody just calls in to a radio program and they're talking, and I swear multiple times you can hear someone's voice and you think you know how old they are, but it turns out it's completely different. Someone will be like, "Oh, yeah, yeah, well, I have a question." And then they're like, "Okay, how old are you, kid?" "I'm 51 years old." I mean, that's happened to me multiple times when I would have thought that person was a teenager. Just some people sound either very light or very immature in some way. But I want to digress from that because one thing that is frequently discussed in some of the newspaper clippings that have been assembled by QCS is that there is a very big amount of attention that's been paid to Donald L. Blinko running for public office and being recognized as a financial analyst. But I think that what he's more recognized for is being a strong supporter of the arts, particularly opera as well as other types of performing arts. And I mean, there's even a newspaper clipping from the suburban scene that says, planning to attend the Marin are Messrs. And Madams Charles Tolan, Jack Rollicksfen, Frank J. Collins, Rufus G. Thayer, and Donald L. Blinko. And this is a preview of the reception being held for the Center of Asian Art and Culture in Golden Gate Park, honoring the world-renowned Chinese master painter Chang Dai-Chien. The exhibit, Chang Dai-Chien, a retrospective, covers the period from 1928 to the present. And again, that's just being a supporter of the arts. And in another newspaper clipping that was uncovered from the suburban scene about Donald L. Blinko, just is called Dinner to Honor Opera Director. A dinner party at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Ellis M. Stevens in Ross tonight will honor Dr. and Mrs. Jan Popper of Los Angeles. Afterward, Dr. Popper, director of opera at the University of California, Los Angeles, will give a preview of Gaetano's Donizetti's La Favorita. I don't speak Italian, and I don't pretend to. In the auditorium of the Del Mar School in Tiburon, sponsored by the San Francisco Opera Action of Marin. Other guests will be Mrs. John C. Alexander of Sausalito and Mr. and Mrs. Donald L. Blinko. So, what I wanted to reinforce was this guy did not just have some casual interest in opera. That's not just something that he wrote down on the form. As you see, he's attending dinners where he is honoring people who are contributing to the world of opera. Dinner to honor opera director. But right now, I would like to turn it over to you once again. What do you think about Donald L. Blinko as a Zodiac killer suspect? What do you think about some of these observations that have been made by Queen City Stripes or QCS? And you can share anything you want. You can say that you think this person's a reasonable suspect. You think this person's an unreasonable suspect. And there's no right or wrong answer. I think you can tell from the way that I've been sharing this presentation that I think that Donald L. Blinko would have had the brain to have been the Zodiac, somebody who could have learned about a lot of the very specific things that the Zodiac is talking about in the letters from his time in the military with the Coast Guard, dealing with things like radians and inches along the radians. Pilots and sailors use radians, and The American Practical Navigator is a book that frequently talks about navigation and radians, and being in the Coast Guard, he would have been exposed to things like that. And I have to give credit to Michael Cole, author of the Zodiac Revisited trilogy, who is the one who pointed out that he believes the Zodiac read the book The American Practical Navigator. That's his observation. And also, I really don't want to downplay the opera connection, but I've already kind of stated that. Now, to provide some genuine pushback and challenges against Donald L. Blinko, it appears that QCS was looking through the census and directories and was trying to see if certain names would match up to a person who could fit the Zodiac Killer's description, and Donald L. Blinko seemed like the most likely candidate. Now, is that the most effective way? I have some doubts about that because I think that it would be so much more convincing if, say, for example, you didn't have any of the preceding material. If you just try to look at some possibilities, like if you had a computer program that would just generate 5 names or something like that. Oh, well, here are 5 possible solutions to the Z13. And you search 4 of them, and none of them seem to match up with any residents of the Bay Area. Ah, but this name does, Donald L. Blinko, and it turns out he was a Bay Area resident. If it were done like that, I think he would go much higher on my list of suspects. But it appears that there is a little bit of influence from outside things, particularly census data and census information on Donald L. Blinko that would push him to the top of the list. Now, you might be wondering, what type of rating would he get out of 10? Give Donald L. Blinko a 5 out of 10 or a 50% chance of being the Zodiac Killer. And before you think that that is high or low, gave a 5 out of 10 to Arthur Lee Allen, the prime suspect in the Zodiac Killer mystery. Now, Donald L. Blinko seems like somewhat of a reasonable suspect. You might notice a few different things about him. Very different hair than anything the Zodiac Killer was described of having, except maybe the Lake Berryessa foyer. But again, the photos that were used in this presentation weren't from 1969. And people can cut their hair, they can grow their hair out longer, and so on. And I also think that there are some similarities in the handwriting and also some differences. Again, 5 out of 10. Now, that would be a big challenge question for you guys. What did you think about the handwriting sample presented in regards to Donald L. Blinko? Do you think that resembles the Zodiac Killer's handwriting? And I told you I gave this a 5 out of 10. What do you think about this entire presentation? And please put your ideas in the comments section down below. And I also want to kind of switch gears a little bit and have a concluding message for you guys. And I'll share that in just a second, but I do want to remind you guys that this episode has been brought to you by Capital One. If you sign up for the Capital One Quicksilver, you can get $200 as a sign-on bonus. I've done this myself. It's like getting free money. I cannot emphasize that enough. Free money, $200 when you sign up, and there will be a link posted in the description box as well as in the quick reference. But to get back on point, this week on the channel, there are going to be some West Virginia vlogs. As some of you know, I was out of the country for a while, but I am now back in West Virginia, coming to you from West Virginia, not only at heart, but right here in the Mountain State. And I'm going to try and do some West Virginia vlogs that are going to come out on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Last year on the channel, I made a couple of episodes, which I called Ned's Journal, and they're going to come back and be done in somewhat of a different way, and please look out for those here on BlackBoxOnlineRadio. And I do want to apologize that I didn't put out a segment in the audiobook Down the Dark Lane last weekend, but I'm going to definitely try to get back on track with that, and there'll be a segment coming out on the weekends. On the weekends, I'm just trying to release chapters of the audiobooks that I've created, and the first one was called Killer on a White Horse. That novel is completely up there. There's a playlist for that, which you can visit, and you can listen to the entire audiobook online for free. Please don't pay any money for it from Amazon.com. I invite you to just listen to the thing on YouTube for free. There are some typos and mistakes in the paperback version, but I think a lot of it got smoothed out for the audiobook. And as far as Down the Dark Lane goes, I was very impressed with the way that the first story in that book happened. It's Down the Dark Lane, Three Thrillers from the Motel. And the first story, I think, came out very nicely, almost um, to create the type of story that I wanted to create. And the second one is still going on, not quite as close to perfection as I wanted. Still some errors in the presentation, but I would absolutely invite you to check out the second story, which is called Green Green Charlie. The interesting thing about that one is it was somewhat of a prototype for the novel Killer on a White Horse, which I wrote in 2020, and in 2010 I wrote Green Green Charlie, which was a story that was about 100 pages long. And I used it as somewhat of the source material for Killer on a White Horse. And you can hear that if you listen to the audiobook, and those segments are going to be coming out on the weekends. And as far as anything else goes, I just want to say thank you so much for listening to this episode of Black Box Online Radio. One more time, you can hit the like button and subscribe if you want to follow along with the true crime discussions and the audiobooks, murder mysteries, all of that stuff. And most importantly, the absolute most important thing for this episode, what do you think about Donald L. Blanco as a Zodiac killer suspect? He is a new suspect that was just recently brought to my attention by Queen City Stripes. Thank you once again to Queen City Stripes for creating the presentation and the images. And I think that Queen City Stripes has gone through an enormous amount of effort to try and create this suspect profile, not only the computer program parts, but also going through old newspaper articles, obtaining things like his social security application, and so on. And I think that some of that deserves a certain amount of respect. So please share whatever you want in the comment section down below. Just be respectful. And that will be all for me now. And I will see you over on Instagram, BlackBoxNed88 over there. You can follow Black Box Online Radio on Facebook. I'm using the Facebook page a lot more. You can also get my personal page, Ned Dahan, that's in the description box, and Black Box Online Radio over on AOL.com. Did I say that right? BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. That's my email address. And for now, goodbye.